So you guys are on camera. I'm going to try to pull up Dr. Stanton now. I think maybe one strategy today, because you know how you tend to get on a roll, right? Is raise your hand, be like, you know, draw attention to yourself if you want to interject something or raise a question, right?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to rebuttal with them. Like, there's not really.
Well, I don't think rebutting is quite the
not the proper term to use, but you know what I mean. Like,
I think interjecting and asking questions and prompting him is a good thing to do. But I think you're right. Rebutting is probably not the right thing to do. You know what I mean?
But is he going to follow the same, like, how he has all the questions, he's just going to read them and then give his response?
no, dude,
I don't know. I think where we're going to start today is probably with whether or not you can buy a genocide, or whether or not you can buy a piece. Actually, we need that light so that we can see who's in the classroom. Otherwise, it was kind of murky yesterday. Yeah. Just gotta go to the bathroom. Don't say like Dr. Stanton, can I go to the bathroom? And probably say you're 18 years old. I think you're more than capable. You're kidding me.
I can't.
Hello.
Hello. Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you today?
I'm fine. How was the class?
Great. We're just settling in here, and I want to make sure I turn the pan over with my laptop to get a good picture.
Yeah. See the bill?
Good. And we are going to have a couple of people in and out. Another teacher who has been doing a unit on genocide, who uses the Stanford experiments.
Yes. Very important.
She's going to be coming in a little bit later just to observe, you know, and hang out. So
Good.
you'll just see some people milling around. Don't worry about it.
Sure.
Okay?
Yeah, the Stanford experiments and also the experiments at Yale are really very useful for understanding genocide.
Huh. And then Stanley Milgram is one of those?
Yeah, Milgram's the Yale experiment. Yeah.
Okay. Right, because I know that a couple different English teachers use that. I'm trying to get you up on the big screen, so be patient with me for a second.
Be very, very patient.
We have a better connection, it looks like, today.
Yeah, it's very clear.
And let's see if I can do that again. Sometimes our Apple AirPlay is a little
Yeah.
persnickety.
I still believe in wonders.
Yeah, that's true. All right.
I'm old-fashioned.
Well, I'm
I still
impressed.
use an office that's connected with a wire.
It's more reliable, I'll give you that.
Yeah, doesn't run out of batteries.
Let me see here, full screen. There we go.
Okay.
All right. And
I'm not sure they want to see a full screen of this bald head up there.
Hey, it happens to the best of us.
Oh,
All right.
man.
We also have in the back corner, Devon. You could wave if you can see you.
Hi. How are you?
Good, how are you?
Our librarian. She's been working with me very closely on this project for a couple of years for research skills. So the academic side of this is research standards and just learning how to wade through a lot of information.
Right.
So.
And there's sure not out there, unfortunately. That's one of the jobs that Genocide Watch tries to make a little easier, because our websites, select news that we consider reliable and put it up on our website, so you don't have to sift through everything.
Right. So we were, I think where we left off, you were asked a very provocative question about whether you could buy a genocide or whether you...
Yeah, and we talked about the Guatemalan genocide as possibly an example of that. And there are many others. I think probably the genocide in Gambela province, Ethiopia, was purchased by the Chinese They wanted to move the people of Gambela province, Anuak, off of their land because the Chinese had discovered oil there and also had wanted the land to farm because China is short of land and wants a lot of products. And so they got the Ethiopian government. I mean, it's not direct responsibility, but the Chinese paid the Ethiopian government for these things, and in response, the Ethiopian government conducted a genocide in 2003 against the Anuak people of Gambela province, drove tens of thousands of them off their land, and many of them are still in refugee camps in southern Sudan. They killed well over 1,000 people on the very first day of the genocide, December 13th, 2003. I mean, I think that's another example of a purchased genocide. And I'm afraid to say this, but you can argue that there is direct responsibility also for the intentional degradation of the environments of whole groups of people by huge corporations, and not just corporations, also by nation states, that result in the deaths of many people. And that, I would say, is genocidal because it creates the conditions of life that are intended to destroy people. And so, you know, if you take a look at the gold mining, for instance, in West Papua, or Irian Jaya, as the Indonesians call it, which has put mercury in the water everywhere and killed off literally hundreds or even thousands of people. That's one of the biggest gold mining companies in the world. And so the Indonesian government actually does kill people to protect them. So, you know, I think that one should not ignore that economic aspect of genocide. In fact, I'd say it was very central to the genocides carried out by colonial governments. Possibly the worst were the genocides carried out by the Spanish in all of the Americas, but in particular in certain countries in the Americas like Colombia, Argentina, in Chile, and all up and down Latin America. And then also the genocide carried out in the Congo by the Belgian king, Leopold. You could read about that. There's a whole book about that genocide, and the estimates are up to 10 million Congolese people died under his rule. He was after rubber. They didn't have synthetic rubber then, and so they wanted to turn everything in the Congo into a rubber plantation. And there was wild rubber all over the Congo, and so they required villages to go and tap it. And a village that did not tap enough rubber had people that got their hands chopped off. And there are literally pictures of, you know, huge baskets full of hands. This is what King Leopold did to the Congo. Finally, an American missionary organized a world campaign, one of the first human rights campaigns in history, to drive that king out of direct rule of the Congo. And so the Belgian government took over. They weren't much of an improvement, but they were sure a big improvement over Leopold. So that was a purchased genocide in a way that he was after money. He actually went and studied how the Spanish made their American colonialism profitable. It was one of the few colonial systems that was truly profitable. He studied it, and then he tried to duplicate it in the Congo.
So, Dr. Stanton, I have one question for you today, and then I really want you to focus on the students' questions. But
yes,
when you mentioned this American missionary who intervened in the Congo, that would have been around 1900, correct?
that's exactly.
So are we evolving as a species to be more concerned and more involved in staving off disaster like this than ever before in history?
Yes, I do believe we are. And the reason I believe that is, well, it's something that a very great Catholic theologian named Teilhard de Chardin wrote about way back in the 1930s. He said the direction of history is the evolution of complexity consciousness. He said our consciousness is becoming more and more complex. We are more and more connected to each other, and we are going to become so connected to each other that we will almost become a new kind of human being. I think we can see it today. Just look at the internet. If that isn't an incredible evolution of complexity consciousness, I don't know what is. Here I am, talking to you in a classroom at Mount Desert High School, in the middle of an island way up in Maine, and I'm sitting in my nice, comfy, warm office here in Virginia, and we can talk. That's amazing. And you know, when you think about it also, we know about a genocide going on in Myanmar today because of television and because of our mass media. In 1900, when this genocide was going on in the Congo, it literally took weeks to have a letter get from the Congo to London or to Belgium. I remember that myself when I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Cote d'Ivoire in Ivory Coast in West Africa. It would take a couple weeks for my lettergrams to get back to my parents that I was writing, and it would take a couple weeks for their letters to get to me. We didn't get on Skype and talk all the time. Now my son is a Peace Corps volunteer in Kosovo and his wife, and you know, we talk every week by Skype. So it's just, or by what's it called, FaceTime on Apple. It's just amazing. So I do think we're closer to that kind of complexity. Now the question though is, have we evolved enough? And the answer on that one is, I think, no. Because it's one thing to be conscious of somebody else's suffering. It's another thing to decide to do something about it. Now there's a very famous experiment that was done by a social psychologist out at the University of Oregon, who's a good friend of mine, in which he showed a picture of a little boy in Mali named Musa, and showed it to people and said, this boy is starving. Now, we have three very reliable organizations just near his village there. We have the Red Cross, we have Catholic Relief Services, and we have World Vision. And those three are well known for their honesty, for not having any corruption. And so we want to make sure that this little boy is fed. Will you give $5? Well, over half the people responded and said yes, and gave the money. They showed another picture of a little girl named Pt.2, same village, same story. Again, over half the people would give the $5. When they showed the two pictures together, the response rate went down to about 30%. Think about that. And then when they said, these two children, Musa and Pt.2, represent tens of thousands of children who are starving to death in the Sahel region of Africa, just south of the Sahara Desert, will you give $5 to one of these organizations, all of whom are honest, and will get the money to help those people? Will you give $5 to one of these organizations? The response rate went down to 10%. In other words, we are apparently, as a species, still locked into our tribal view of humanity. We still respond best to people who are across the street or in our family or who are in our town, because those are the people who we get to know, up close, who we are immediately in contact with. It's very hard for us to put ourselves in the shoes of people who are literally halfway around the world. And statistics don't motivate anybody. Stalin was famous for saying, one murder is a crime, killing 1 million people is a statistic. And there's unfortunately a lot of truth to that. Just look at our responses, for instance, to the Rwandan genocide where 800,000 people were killed. Or to the Rohingya genocide right now, going on right now. Or to the Sudanese genocides, because there are many now going on simultaneously, in which at least 600,000 people have been killed in just since 2003. And before that, another 2 million. This is one of the most murderous regimes in history. The leader of it has even been indicted for genocide by the International Criminal Court, and yet he's still walking around Africa a free man. We do not have, apparently, the political will to take action to actually prevent genocide. Part of it is the failure of our international institutions. The United Nations is a deeply, fatally, I think, flawed institution. It is not, I'm not against the United Nations, we need it. I'm pro-United Nations. But because we have the veto in the Security Council, which has the ultimate authority to authorize the use of force, we almost never get forceful action to prevent or stop genocide. There's always some country that wants to stand in the way. And we know that, for instance, most recently in Syria, where Russia and China literally vetoed the resolutions that would have taken action. Now, I have some very concrete proposals to change that. You can read about them on our website. You know, I used to write UN resolutions for the State Department, so I know the UN inside out. And the truth is, the General Assembly also has the authority to authorize forceful action if the UN Security Council is paralyzed. There was a resolution that we got passed in 1950 when the UN Security Council was paralyzed, and Russia had the stupidity of walking out, the Soviet Union, of walking out of the Security Council, thereby not having a veto. And during that absence, we got the Uniting for Peace resolution passed by the Security Council, which authorizes specifically the General Assembly to authorize forceful action when the Security Council is paralyzed and cannot. And by a 2/3 vote, the General Assembly can authorize the action, and that is exactly how we got the Korean police action, as it's called in UN terms, authorized. When we drove back North Korea after it had invaded South Korea. It's not even called a war in UN terms because it was specifically authorized by the UN General Assembly. So, you know, we have mechanisms that could be used. Nowadays, by the way, I brought that up a number of times in the State Department, and they said, oh, well, we don't like that resolution because we don't have a veto. So you see, it's still not there. We don't have the resolution. And we do have an International Criminal Court now, but, for example, we do not have a standing international army or police force. I don't think we even need an army. We could have a international police force, and it could go into these places. If we had such a force, we could go in and arrest Omar al-Bashir, the leader of Sudan, but we don't have that yet.
Because if you arrest the leadership, it is preventable, right?
That is what our conclusion has been, yes. Most genocides require leadership. And, I mean, there are genocides that are done by mobs, such as the during Indian partition, when they divided India into Pakistan, India. There were mob-led genocides. But most genocides are led by leaders of a country. And so if you can take out those leaders in some way or another, I'm not saying you have to kill them, but I think arresting them, putting them on trial is the best solution. That's what I'd like to see done, of course, ultimately, with North Korea. I would like to see enough consequences be presented to the other people and military leaders of North Korea to realize that they could be put on trial too unless they stop Kim Jong-un from his current madness, I think, nuclear madness, and then eventually overthrow him. And I think that will happen eventually. And eventually he and his comrades, who have a huge gulag of concentration camps all over Korea, they'll be put on trial for that. There's just been a report presented to the UN General Assembly that make that very clear what they're doing. I recommend you take a look at it. It was just presented a few days ago. Anyway, enough said. I've been talking too much again. So let me just let you guys ask the questions. And Griffin, you had that question, I remember it, that can you buy genocide? The question he asked also, though, as a follow-up, can you buy prevention of a genocide? Well, I'm not too sure yet. As I just was saying, I don't think we have the institutions yet to do it. We do have some regional organizations like NATO and ASEAN, the Organization of American States, that have played very useful roles. And the Economic Community of West African States stopped the genocides in Sierra Leone and Liberia. So we do have regional organizations that can be effective. That does take lots of money. It also takes political commitment. So that, I would say, is the best we can do right now. But over the long term, I'm convinced the only way to stop and prevent genocides is education. You're going to do it. It's going to take long after I am gone for this to really go away as a human problem. Anyway, enough.
Are you familiar with the project that Terry Nicholson was involved in, where they were trying to get Sudanese students to have smartphones so they could FaceTime?
Yeah, I know Terry, and I guess he's talked to your class.
Yes.
Yeah, it's very smart. I mean, that's a real good use of this increasing consciousness that we were talking about earlier.
Right.
I'd like to see smartphones in the hands of people all over the world, and that is already happening, of course. I mean, there's nothing that these totalitarian regimes can do to stop it. And there is, for instance, an app that the International Bar Association has developed called Eyewitness. Look it up. You can put it on your smartphone, and you can film what's going on. You know, you can take a movie, what's going on when troops are in a village, say, killing people and so forth, and you can upload that via satellite, would you believe? And it goes directly into a computer in London, controlled by the International Bar Association, and it's time-stamped, it's GPSed, so you know where it was taken, and it can then be held as evidence. And you can tell if it's been tampered with, because you know you can tell if something like that that's going into a computer has been tampered with. So it's actually already being used in courts in Europe, in German courts, for instance. They accepted this as evidence. It is necessary in a court to establish what is called a chain of custody of evidence. You have to prove that the evidence, you know, couldn't have been tampered with on the way from where it was gathered to the court. Well, this method that the International Bar Association has got with on phone, simple app on your phone, I've got one on my phone, is a huge contribution, and it just uses smartphones. Okay, sorry, we go on.
Can you see Griffin?
Yeah, Griffin.
There comes the Sudan one. Okay. So I've been researching the Sudan, South Sudan conflict, specifically the Darfur war. Me and Andrew is sitting next to me. I've been saying that for a while now. And just from looking on paper, it seems a lot more like faction warfare as opposed to a genocide. I was wondering if you could shine a little light on why the huge aspects, why it is genocide as opposed to a faction warfare.
Okay. Well, yeah, let me first of all address this idea that somehow warfare is excludes it being genocide. The truth is most genocides occur during wars, during civil wars or international wars. In other words, the two things are not mutually exclusive. What's happening in Sudan, in Darfur, in Blue Nile, in Nuba Mountains, South Kordofan, and so forth, is both civil war and genocide. One of the biggest mistakes that was made on the Rwandan genocide is our ambassador there said, oh, this is not genocide, it's a civil war. So the truth is it was both. And that happens usually. In other words, most civil wars also are accompanied with genocidal behavior. In fact, my view is that a lot of war and genocide come out of the same steps, the same stages, because dehumanization is so important in both. And they also have lots of the other stages. Anyway, the politics of Sudan, as you have studied, are that the Arab elite in Khartoum want to make themselves the power of Sudan and dominate the whole country. So these groups, such as the Four, the Masali, the Masali in Darfur, are seen as hindrances to that absolute control. So what they try to do is drive them out of their villages, killing all the men that they can and boys, raping all the women that they can, and also killing a lot of them, and driving them out. And then replace them with people speaking Arabic who will go to those areas to farm and so forth, and those Africans will never be able to go back. This kind of depopulation and change of the demography is also characteristic of genocide. So what we've got is both. You have action by the Sudanese government with bombers, and they supply the weapons to what were once called the Janjaweed, devils on horseback, and are now made into an official rapid response force by the Sudanese government. These thugs, these killers, have been turned into official government forces. It's definitely genocide. It's probably killed about 600,000 people. It's also targeted at them because of their ethnic identity. That makes it genocide. In fact, for the Sudanese, they see it also as a racial identity because they talk about these people as blacks. They call them blacks. They call them slaves. In the history of Sudan, you probably know, slavery was an important part of the Sudanese history, and where the slaves came from the black areas of Sudan, and the Arabs had the slaves. So it's part of a history, and yet it is also genocide.
Awesome.
Okay.
How about someone else? Drake has a question.
Yes.
You can't see Drake?
It's okay. I can hear you guys way better than I could yesterday, by the way.
Okay, so how would you create an international police force without having a bias towards or against certain countries?
Could you hear that?
Yes, I could. That's a very good question. Well, Articles 43 through 47 of the United Nations Charter actually provide for such a force, and they've never been implemented. The basic structure of that kind of a force would have to be negotiated within the United Nations. And I'm quite sure that the many interests in the world, not just the great powers, not just the Perm Five and the other great powers like Brazil or Nigeria, some of the others, India, who aren't part of the Security Council permanently, I think they'd all have a lot to say about how that force was constituted, and so also with the other, 60 some countries in the world, it's even more, I think, 190 countries in the world. They'd all have a voice in how that force would be constituted. But in terms of political bias, well, that's another hard question, and I'm sure there would be a problem, because deciding when that force would be sent in would be one big political question every time it would be sent in. The important thing, though, is we need such a force because it needs to be ready to go. It needs to be ready fast. Genocides happen fast. Right now we don't have it, and I think we suffer for it, because the result is certain countries, like our own, then take it upon themselves to organize their own little coalitions, usually exclusive to those that are allied with them, and then declare war. So that's why we got into Iraq. That's why we got into Afghanistan. We got into lots of places where it would have been made way better if it had been through a UN force of some kind. But because of the veto in the Security Council, that hasn't been possible. We would like to see it, and in fact, I've even proposed what's called an optional protocol to the Rome Treaty of the International Criminal Court. That means it wouldn't have to go through the UN. That's the reason. To create a international police force to enforce arrest warrants issued by the International Criminal Court. You can look it up on our website. Okay.
Other questions? Right here.
Okay.
Olivia, this is Olivia.
Hi. Okay, so, in your opinion, do you consider the dirty war in Argentina politicide or a genocide? And what do you think is the defining characteristic of why it's one or the other?
It was both. The reason why I can say it was, of course, obviously it was political. So it's a politicide. The people who were killed, well over 10,000, probably more than that, in Argentina by the right-wing military junta. They were dropped out of helicopters and so forth, arrested, put in these torture prisons and so forth, and just murdered. And they took away their children. There are lots of kids now who were adopted by the military in Argentina who are the orphans of those people who were killed. The main reason was because they said, oh, these people are leftists, they're communists. Well, that was political. The question then is, was it also genocide? Well, under Argentinian law, interestingly enough, yes, it is. Genocide is defined in Argentina's law on genocide as including the destruction of political, social, and economic groups. In other words, Argentina's law actually is broader than the Genocide Convention. So these generals could actually be tried for genocide in Argentina and convicted under Argentine law. That is a really interesting thing. Now, in other words, the Argentinians adopted a version of the definition of genocide that was much closer to Lincoln's original definition than what we now have in the Genocide Convention. Under the Genocide Convention, it's pretty hard to say that this was genocide, because I don't believe these people were selected because of their ethnic, national, racial, or religious identity. Those are the four groups that are protected by the Genocide Convention. But truth be told, in Argentina, yes, it's genocide.
What else, guys? There are other questions looming out there. Kate, you have a question? Yeah. Okay. Do you still have that list in front of you?
Yeah, I've still got it. In fact, it's a wonderful list. One of these questions was quite interesting to me. It says, does a genocide ever start as a genocide and become a humanitarian crisis, or vice versa? Answer, yes, of course. And in fact, there's so many instances, you could just go through the whole list of genocides, and almost all of them have. Rwanda, it started as a genocide, and then it became a humanitarian crisis. Congo, Somalia, Syria, Myanmar, and they also go in the opposite direction. They can become humanitarian crises and then turn into genocides. In Myanmar, for instance, there was a terrible cyclone that just wiped out much of the lowlands of Myanmar, and it put Myanmar in such a terrible state economically that many people say that was one of the reasons why then the Myanmar regime turned even more viciously against the Rohingya and against other groups. You can say also that a humanitarian crisis in Somalia led to genocide. They had a huge famine. So, the two are definitely linked.
So in that,
Okay, now-
in that way, with your experience, did the American bombing of Cambodia create the environment in which that was possible?
That's a really good question. Let me talk about that because I know quite a bit about Cambodia, having lived there. Been the man behind the Cambodian Tribunal. It was my life work, really. The answer is that the American bombing alienated a lot of Cambodians, and it also made the propaganda by the Khmer Rouge much more credible. That if we don't unite against these American invaders, then they're going to kill all of us. So the Khmer Rouge gained a good deal of support because of our bombing campaign. So it contributed to the Khmer Rouge takeover. Did it contribute to the genocide? I don't think so. Because the Khmer Rouge already were genocidal. They were already killing and mass murdering people in areas they controlled. The war in Cambodia was a war against what we saw as a Maoist communist movement, a threat to the government in Cambodia. In that sense, we were right about that. It really was a threat. But then the way we pursued the war was so stupid, so counterproductive. Using B-52s from 30,000 feet to bomb villages all over Cambodia, that it drove Cambodians into the arms of the Khmer Rouge. It was really incredibly stupid. We also supported the overthrow of a popular prince, Prince Sihanouk, who was the royalty in Cambodia, and a general named Lon Nol overthrew him with our support. And guess what? Prince Sihanouk then allied himself with the Khmer Rouge, giving them huge legitimacy with the Cambodian people. I don't think that ever would have happened if we had continued to support Sihanouk and his attempts to keep Cambodia neutral in the Vietnam War. So it's true that our behavior contributed to the Khmer Rouge genocide, but I don't think it caused it. In other words, I think the Khmer Rouge would have done it anyway if they'd taken over, and they sure did it. I think that was, in fact, seeing it firsthand as I did was what changed my life. When I went to Cambodia and talked to the people who survived that genocide, I knew that the rest of my life had to be spent fighting genocide.
But had the CIA or the United States Army focused their energies on Pol Pot and the leadership, things may have turned out differently, right?
I don't know. It's hard to say that because Pol Pot and the so-called leadership was so secretive that even to find them during that war was very difficult. I'm not sure we could have. We didn't have the modern, electronic surveillance means that we do even now. We didn't have targeting drones and smart bombs and all the other things. In other words, I think actually it would have been hard to just concentrating on the leadership. It was a Maoist revolution. It was based on popular support, and that made it really hard to just focus on Pol Pot and the leaders.
Oh, we got Griffin again, if that's okay.
So I
That's fine.
like question. Does it become a humanitarian crisis or shift to a genocide or vice versa? Is that based on intent alone? So once the intent changes, the definition changes?
What often happens is that you'll have a humanitarian crisis following a genocide. Note the intent is characteristic of genocide. The people committing the genocide have the intent to destroy a group. So that's why it's genocide. But then after they do that, and after they're out of power, which pretty much always happens, then you have a vast humanitarian crisis. I mean, I remember when there were 2 million Rwandan refugees in what's now the Congo, what was then called Zaire, in camps. And they had cholera epidemics and everything else. I mean, it was just terrible. People were, dying. So that type of sequence from genocide to humanitarian crisis is pretty obvious. The other way around, however, is less obvious. What happened in Ethiopia, for instance, where a huge famine, which resulted in starvation of a lot of people and a lot of disease, was then followed by a Mengistu communist government trying to wipe out all of its enemies, a genocidal campaign. That was where you had a humanitarian crisis first, followed by a genocide. So the intent then, in other words, was most apparent during the genocide. But there have been many arguments, and I think rightly, accusations that famine was also humanly caused. In other words, that there were intentional aspects to the famine. They didn't give relief to the people that they wanted to wipe out.
I have a question for you. So, in the last 2 years, we've seen a lot of news reports. These guys watch the news all the time. About the refugee crisis in Europe. And when you look at, say, the current the elections last year in Austria, and maybe Brexit and changing dynamics of European politics, what does that signal to you, if anything?
It's the after effect of genocide. It's a consequence. The Syrian government has been carrying out genocide against its own people ever since the Arab Spring. It's a genocide that's gone on now for at least 6-7 years. And they have killed so many people, at least 500,000, that a lot of other people have fled. And then, of course, ISIS took over in part of Syria. The anti-government resistance, which was also genocidal in nature, the Al-Nusra Front, for instance, which was basically an Al-Qaeda branch. You have all these genocidal forces in one country. No wonder so many Syrians wanted to escape. And they did. They got across the border into Turkey, and then Turkey permitted them to flee across the Aegean Sea or even just directly over the border, and then inundate Europe with all these refugees. It's a very understandable consequence of a genocide. It's also, by the way, why cowardice in the hands, in the face of genocide, or lack of action in the face of genocide, results in even worse consequences. If we had been able to, for instance, early on with Assad's government in Syria, say, look, if you're going to do this to your people, we are going to make sure we intervene. We're going to send in our own troops to stop you. If we had said that, and Europe backed us on it, and Europe is basically pacifist, you can understand it. They've been through so many wars, they don't want any more wars. So they wouldn't back us on this. But if we had said that early on, all of that could have probably been prevented. It's just that we don't seem to be able to muster the political will in time to do it. So refugee crises are direct consequences of genocide. You can see it again in Myanmar and Bangladesh right now.
And what do you see in the United States politics? I know you have a question
Well,
on there about that, right?
I do. It's a fascinating and interesting question. Do you think the United States could be more involved in stopping genocides? If so, how? And then where do you think the United States fails in the stages of genocide? I do believe we could do a lot more. Now, I don't mean we should just send the Marines whenever we think there's going to be a genocide. I think we could be much more active in our diplomacy and our use of targeted sanctions, for instance, against genocidal leaders, making it impossible for them to travel, to have bank accounts overseas, all of the things that we could do. This country is enormously powerful. A lot of people really don't understand how powerful unless you work inside, say, the State Department. If we decide to impose financial sanctions on the leaders of a country or on a country, as we did with Iran, we can shut it down. Literally, our banks are the central banks of the world. If we don't permit Iranian banks to bank through our banking system, we shut them down. It's an incredibly powerful situation for us, and we don't use it enough. I think coming up with creative ways, for instance, that we could put pressure on leaders in other countries not to commit genocide against their own people would be also something that we need to do more of. Usually we're bystanders. Usually we just watch it. And we say, oh, isn't this terrible? And we wring our hands and we send in humanitarian relief. That's the point of Samantha Power's famous book, A Problem from Hell. She says, American foreign policy has actually not been a failure on genocides, it's been a success because American foreign policy has been, don't intervene, send humanitarian aid. I think we must do much more than that. I think we should be ready to intervene, and I also think, though, we have to do it multilaterally. I don't think we should ever try to do it unilaterally. It's especially important to get other countries in the region that are surrounding where the genocide has happened to support that intervention. Also, and this is where, again, I emphasize education, I think we could put a huge amount of money and resources into educating students all around the world about how genocide happens and how to stop it.
Yeah.
Now, there was a really interesting question I should definitely address if somebody else going to bring it up, and that was this whole question of the pervasive presence of rape in genocides. It's characteristic of every genocide I know of. And you have to understand that genocide is a political act to assert power. Well, that is also exactly where rape is. Rape doesn't have to do with sex. It has with the assertion of power. That's why women today who are speaking out against male harassment are right to do that, because it is an assertion of male patriarchal power over women that they are protesting. And it's wonderful that that's happening right now. Well, the same kind of power, at its logical extreme, of course, is rape. And that's why it happens in every genocide I've ever studied. Women are sometimes spared in genocides simply so they can bear the children of the perpetrators of the genocide. That is a direct attempt to change the genetic makeup of the population. It's genocide, really.
Wasn't that Ravan Karajic's plan?
That was exactly his plan. That's right. And it is the plan in Darfur, too. And it has been the plan in lots of other genocides. In the Rwandan genocide, they would rape the women, but a lot of other women were simply killed because that was one of the what you could call total genocides. Armenia, the Holocaust, and Rwanda are the three really total genocides that we know of, in which the objective, modern genocides, the objective was to kill every single person of the other group. There have been others, though. The total genocides of Texas Indians, for instance, of some groups of Indian tribes in the United States, that was also total genocide. The total genocide of the Tasmanians by Australian settlers, where they killed literally every single Tasmanian. Those were total genocides too, but most genocides are partial. That's why the convention talks about in whole or in part. That is a part of the convention that is often forgotten. People say, oh, it's not genocide because look, they only killed 10,000 people. That's still genocide if the objective was to kill part of the population of an ethnic, national, religious, or racial group in order to destroy the group. That means as part of a plan to destroy the group. We could kill off the leaders, for instance, of the Hutu in Burundi, as they did in 1972. They killed about 100,000 Hutu. They didn't kill all the Hutu, but it was still very definitely genocide because they tried to kill every educated Hutu they could find. Kill the leaders. So, that sort of aspect of genocide, rape, and the attempt to totally destroy a group culturally is another aspect that we need to keep in mind. What we've done to the Native Americans, the American Indians in this country, has been genocidal, even when we haven't just killed them all. You don't have to kill everybody to have committed genocide. You can steal their children, as we did. You can try to destroy their cultures, as we did. Basically, it's still genocidal. Now, there was a final question I just want to get to before we quit. It says, how can people just flip a switch and just start killing? Do they lose all feeling for life? That is such an important question. Because remember this, we are the ones who divide the human race the way we do. We are the ones who invent the different so-called races. That was an invented system of classifying people in which, of course, the whites were considered superior, they were master race, and all the other races below them were considered inferior. It was invented in the middle of the 19th century. We're still using it on our forms in the United States, where we have to check off what race we belong to. You know what? There's only one race, the human race. I can tell you that as an anthropologist. 99% of our genetic makeup is identical. We are part of the same race. And these divisions that we divide on color, for instance, those are superficial. They're the result of tens of thousands of years of evolution in different climates and so forth. We're still part of the same race. It's finding that truth that we must really concentrate on. How do you just flip a switch and start killing like people did in Rwanda? People who live next to each other and killed each other. If you can convince people that the other people aren't fully human, that they're cockroaches, or they're vermin, or that they're somehow a threat to you, or you want their land, you can turn people into monsters very quickly. That's something where, let me just say this. In the State Department one time, I was at a meeting in which they were asking whether we should give the green light to a man named Laurent Kabila to invade the Congo to overthrow a leader there named Mobutu, who was very corrupt. really evil person. And he was going to be supported by the Rwandan army. We had a lot of influence on the Rwandans and on the Rwandan army. So what we said would make a big difference. We were sitting around in this big conference room, and finally I raised my hand and I said, how many of you know anything about Laurent Kabila? 2 hands went up. Of course, they were the CIA people, because they actually study these things and stay on a subject long enough to learn something about things. They change people's foreign service appointments in the State Department every couple of years so you don't become an expert. Anyway, only these 2 guys knew. And I said, how many of you knew that he ran a house of prostitution in Dar es Salaam for 4 years? How many of you knew that his men kidnapped some of Jane Goodall's workers in the chimpanzee reserve in Tanzania and held them for $200,000 ransom? Nobody knew this. I said, you know, if you expect this guy to turn into a Democrat overnight, you're very naive. Well, the guy down the table from me, who was Armenian American, by the way, said, Greg, don't you think anybody out there is good? And I said, Richard, I said, you got to remember, I'm a Presbyterian. I'm a Calvinist. We are not surprised by sin. Never forget the capability of evil in every single human heart. Also, the enormous capability of good. We have both capacities. And what we need to do is find how we can encourage those better angels, as Abraham Lincoln put it, to rule the world.
Well, thanks to you, we can actually start really thinking about it. And
Thanks to your students.
And these guys.
Go out there, it's the world. You can do it. Seriously, you can do it.
And we really appreciate it. I don't even know what to do to say a proper thank you.
I think the only proper thank you is for all of your students to learn from this experience and go out there. And Keith, you can keep doing this because as you can tell, I'm not one of these hierarchical guys who think I'm too, it's not worth it to talk to a high school class. Believe me, I think you are the reason why we will beat genocide. So for me, this is what, I've dedicated my life to do, and I'm just grateful to you to be able to think about this with us.
Well, thank you so much. Stay warm out there.
And you too.
And you'll be hearing from us, okay?
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And we'll talk soon. Okay. He's like, I'm out of here.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Wow. Wow. Fun? Hey, you guys, can we make a mess for a second? Just read through the circle. That'd be awesome, and we can debrief a little bit.